IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, you're listening to All Things Policy by the Takshashila Institution. I'm your host for today, Jaison, and in today's episode, we're going to explore the role of Australia's public diplomacy in India. But what is public diplomacy? Public diplomacy, simply put, is the means by which countries promote their vision for international policy in the host country and is very much part of their core national interests. And through various economic, creative, and cultural initiatives, every country seeks to advocate their goals through their interactions with foreign governments, businesses, society, and also individuals. In this episode, we'll try and understand what are Australia's public diplomacy goals and in what ways is it tied to its foreign policy, its larger foreign policy agenda. And what are the different public diplomacy initiatives that Australia has advanced and advances in India as we speak, and why are these public diplomacy initiatives been chosen? To understand this better, I can't think of any person other than our Australian Consul General in Chennai, Ms. Sarah Kirlew. Thanks for joining us, Sarah.
Hi, Carl. Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your Takshashila podcast.
Thank you. So just a brief profile of Sarah. So she's a career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. She has previously served overseas in Beijing, New Delhi, and Cairo. While she was in Canberra, she has worked in a range of Indo-Pacific focused foreign and economic policy roles within the department, including on Australia's strategy for the Indo-Pacific and geo-economic issues. Sarah, I want to get started with our conversation, and I was really looking forward to doing this particular episode with you, given how soft power is a very core aspect of Australia's foreign policy. So you would have heard me describe public diplomacy in fairly ambiguous terms, but how would you describe what public diplomacy means to you, right? Maybe in one line. So maybe we can get started there.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. It's a great topic you've chosen for our discussion today, and one that's very close to my heart. My undergraduate studies were actually in media and communications. So making sure that we nail our public diplomacy messaging has been a big focus of my tenure here in the south of India. I think you did a good job describing what public diplomacy is.
Okay,
it's an amalgam of public relations, of marketing, of using our soft power to achieve our other foreign and trade policy objectives. So when we think about it, we're really looking to showcase Australia on the international stage and make sure that there's a good understanding of the strengths of modern Australia, but we're doing so in support of the particular objective of our post network here in India.
Awesome. As you rightly pointed out, soft power is a very fundamental aspect of, how foreign policy is carried out. I think the way it is executed at, let's say, a country like India would be through public diplomacy initiatives. So if public diplomacy is central to, achieving, a country's foreign policy goals, now as a diplomat, on what basis do you decide the agenda that you want to advocate in a given country? Given, the number of issues that, you could take up in a country like India with overlapping interests, a lot of convergences now with Ekta coming to the fore. So on what basis do you decide, okay, I'm going to focus on this area for the public diplomacy efforts?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So in terms of the way that we do it in my post here in Chennai, we're quite structured in our planning, and we don't start from the public diplomacy angle. We actually start from, well, what are we doing here in Chennai? What is the role of this office? So, we have a big focus on maritime security. We have a focus on trade and investment promotion and also supporting Australia's values. So my team actually will sit down and have a spreadsheet almost that looks at each different thematic that we're working on over the course of the year, and how are we making sure that we're hitting our key messages on that at regular intervals, keeping a good pace of engagement. And I guess, thinking about all the tools we have at our disposal too. So partly it's just, the time and attention of the diplomats in my office. Where are they going to go? What events are they going to choose to speak at? When will we be promoting our message? We really welcome when we have senior visitors from Australia come, and I know that some of those senior visitors have taken the opportunity to do Takshashila podcasts. For instance, we were running a very active line of engagement on space, and we had the head of our space agency come, and so his visit was a great opportunity for him to come and talk to you at Takshashila about that.
Yeah.
We also think about, well, what events can we either host ourselves or participate in? How can we use other aspects of our presence here, either grant programs to maybe support some other messaging, kind of make things have double purpose. We have our social media accounts that we run, and then the use of the traditional media, which still has an enormous reach here in India. So it's a busy space. Of course, it's not just my post. We have now 5 posts here in India with the very welcoming of a new consulate in Bengaluru, which has responsibility for Karnataka and Telangana. So we're really deepening our resources. And we've also had new institutions stood up in Australia. So we now have the Centre for Australia-India Relations, which will be based in Sydney. So all of us are working together. All of us are kind of, let's say, singing the same song, but maybe different verses as we kind of work on what's particular priority in our geographic area of responsibility.
Got it. So you've been in this role for about 2 years, or a little more than 2 years now?
Yeah, that's right. So I've been in Chennai for 2.5 years. And as you mentioned in the introduction, I previously was in New Delhi between 2008 and 2011. So I had 3 years there as well.
Okay. So because, I was very curious to understand this from you in my conversations with other, consul generals also. It's something that I wanted to know whether there's been a marked shift in the broad goals and responsibilities of the consulate, right? From what it was maybe in the 90s to 2000s, and, fast forward to today. Do you see the consulate, especially the Australian consulate in India, playing a larger role in the economic and business front today than it probably would have, some decades ago? And specifically, how does a consulate leverage, the traction that the Ekta has provided to the relationship in your various outreach and initiatives that you carry out?
Yeah, sure. So I think I'm going to take your question almost in 2 parts. The first is, about the way the relationship has changed over that period. And the second is the particular role of consulates as opposed, say, to the High Commission in New Delhi. So, I mean, yes, the consulate has a bigger role because the relationship is so much bigger. Even in the past 10 years, we've seen this extremely rapid acceleration in Australia-India relations. It's no lie to say that the ties have never been closer and the potential for growth has never been greater. So although there's so many things we can point to as very strong progress, we can also see how much more is to come through our comprehensive strategic partnership, the really big strategic drivers that are pushing Australia and India closer together on strategic issues in the Indo-Pacific, on trade, as you say, with the signing of our free trade agreement, ECTA, which was also a strategic signal to business on the importance of looking at each other, including on things like diversification of supply chains. And then sort of the biggest driver of all is probably the growing Australian-Indian diaspora community. So we now have close to 1 million Indian origin Australians in a population of just 25 million, right? And that's like more than doubled in the past 5 years. So it's a community that's growing really fast, and that community becomes the living bridge between our 2 countries, including for business, people who are comfortable operating in both spheres. So yes, I mean, the relationship is just broadening in every direction. And as a consulate, we're lucky enough to be swept along with that tide and have a chance to do a really broad sweep of work. In terms of the difference between a consulate and a High Commission, I think that's also worth maybe digging into just a little bit. The High Commission is the premier office in India, where our High Commissioner, the head of our presence, sits. And they're the ones that are doing the closest negotiation with the Indian government, federal system to federal system at the central level. For us consulates, we're here partly because we recognize how important it is to engage at the state level in a very diversified structure like India. Each state, different religion, sometimes different food, different kind of approach to life. So we know that we need to be in the states as well to seize opportunity, especially in the trade front. So for us consulates, we do a lot more of what I would consider the forward-facing role, out and about, telling the story of Australia. We're a little bit closer to the granularity of business and civil society. And so we carry that sort of public diplomacy is maybe a biggest chunk of our work. It's important in New Delhi too, and they have a very skilled and large team that does it. But they also are doing a range of kind of strategic stuff that we don't do as much of in the consulates. And the other really thing that all the consulates do is consular and passport. Bengaluru is just starting up on some of that. And with that growth in the diaspora has just become much more demand for citizen services. And that's a very important part of what we do here. I guess I should also, for those of your listeners who are not familiar, my headquarters in Canberra is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So in the Australian system, we don't have a separate Ministry of External Affairs and Ministry of Commerce. They are combined into one, and we also run our development program out of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So very much all aspects of those things are part of my role here.
No, very interesting. Since you said that, public diplomacy is one of those key pillars of the function of the consulate here in India. And you described quite eloquently about how distinctive are the roles and responsibilities of the High Commission, say, vis-a-vis the consulate. So I happen to just go over the public diplomacy strategy of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And what caught my eye there was how one of the goals is to support the economic diplomacy objectives. So what exactly do you mean by these economic diplomacy objectives, and who are the stakeholders in India that you engage with to sort of realize these objectives?
Yeah, sure. Why don't I give you a concrete example, one that will resonate with you guys, which is, say, our participation last year in the Bengaluru Technology Summit, the BTS. We've been a partner for many years in a row now, and I would sort of put that under our economic diplomacy agenda. So when we are at the BTS, we have perhaps taken an expo booth, and that is a platform for our Australian companies to come to make connections with Indian counterparts to sell their services. And we work closely with Austrade, which is the trade promotion arm of the Australian government, on that. But it's also, when we have speakers on the panels, that's also a chance for us to show Australian expertise on cyber and critical technology policy. And so we're building that economic diplomacy, that sense of Australia as an expert on some of these issues. And then more broadly, we're just hoping that people who come through the expo are taking away an impression of Australia as a really great place for technology talent to live, to work, to study, and to invest. So if we think about national prosperity as an economy, we need to be able to sell things abroad, but we also want people to invest into Australia, to bring productivity to Australia. We want jobs for our people. So the economic diplomacy agenda is pretty broad, but the things that support that go in underneath it. Whereas, say, cultural diplomacy might be more about selling the story of modern Australia. So we had a very large exhibition of Indigenous textiles called Jaison, and that toured all around India. We showed it in Chennai and in Bengaluru and in a number of other cities. And, that is about making sure that people understand our national identity, not just our European heritage, but also our very strong First Nations cultures.
Yeah, and multicultural diversity as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Yeah, hello. We are back with the podcast. I'm here speaking with Ms. Sarah Kirlew, who is the Australian Consul General in Chennai. Sarah, moving on to what I feel is a very interesting initiative, the Development Aid Program, the DAP. And there's an interesting example that I'd come across from your social media channels, was a support that was extended to the Plant Trust to deploy artificial reefs in Chennai, right? And what struck me was, how this, is a way to implement, Australia's reef conservation practices to, a local context. And also working alongside the local community to sort of, the grant sought to achieve, which is to improve coastal biodiversity. Could you share some insights and observations from, this particular, grant program that you're running with the local community?
Sure, Carl. I'd be delighted to talk about DAP, which is actually the Direct Aid Program, is what the acronym stands for.
Oh, right. Sorry, I got that.
No problem. And that's actually something that we run all around the world. So many of our posts have direct aid programs that they are implementing. And primarily it's a development tool, and it's a way for us to give back to the communities who so kindly host all of our consulates and embassies and high commissions. So we want to work with civil society in the place that we are, just to try and make things better in different ways. So we have run the direct aid program out of Chennai since the consulate was opened. We work with civil society who have the FCRA approvals from the Indian government to work with foreign entities. And we do development programs across a range of areas. You mentioned the Plant Trust project, which I launched last week. And as you say, that was a contribution to the local fishing community to help improve marine biodiversity in the fishing harbour of Chennai by helping to build some artificial reefs where the fish colonies can develop. And that was also a nice kind of public diplomacy opportunity for us, because we were able to launch the project in the same week as the G20 Environment and Climate Sustainability Ministers meeting was happening. So, I mean, we knew the project was coming and we really wanted to highlight it in that week, because it just shows that we're supporting more broadly the agenda that the ministers were discussing in their separate meeting. But we've also done projects around like STEM education for children, so helping to take to classrooms different kits that get kids really hands-on with science. We do work that is around women in leadership, which is a particular passion of mine, as a value that we promote. So when I went out to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands with our previous High Commissioner, Barry O'Farrell, we launched a mentoring program for local kids there, right? Like, it's hard for them far away from mainland India to get internships and business development opportunities. So we helped them with a little bit of that. So it does a really broad sweep of things, but for me, it's an invaluable way to connect in at a different level of India, to kind of meet a whole range of different people who have super interesting perspectives that really help us to understand India better. And if we can give back and do something good, then that's really wonderful as well.
No, absolutely. I think you really brought out the social impact angle of it, right? Which is far-reaching.
Yeah.
And it goes beyond like any one initiative as such. So that's interesting to know. I mean, you touched upon this a little while earlier, which was how social media and how traditional media outreach is just so important to what the consul or to what the consulate does in India. Could you give us a sense of how do you try to leverage social media channels, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram? What are some of the audiences that you are looking at and that you would like to target in a country like India? So could you just take us through what goes into a template of a social media campaign that the Consulate General runs?
Sure, yeah. So we have done quite a bit of work on our social media over the past few years since I came. So we here in Chennai run a Twitter account. Everyone please follow, OzCG Chennai. And we also contribute some content to central accounts run out of the High Commission, a Facebook and an Instagram account. And then all of my Consul General colleagues have Twitter accounts too. All of them are excellent. All of them you should follow. Maybe there's a show notes we can link to. So social media is, as we all know, a really great immediate way to post content, to be able to interact with people. We will mostly post about things that we've been doing. So, when we did that DAP grant I was talking about, put up some photos, we put up a little explanation. And in the text, we normally try to explain why the thing that we're doing is important, both to Australia and to India. So most of our followers are here in India, but some are in Australia. And there's also a role, I think, in Twitter accounts and similar from a consulate to explain back at home the work. My being here is an investment for Australian taxpayers, and so this is a way that they can kind of see the value that we're delivering for them. We also use it for messaging, say, to our consular clients. If there's some sort of natural disaster going on and we need to put out messaging, it's a great way to do that. In terms of the content that if we're doing a campaign, we're thinking about, well, what is the broader message we want here? Is it one around, say, Australian expertise in space? So we might, put out a few tweets in advance of a big expo or something that we're going to, then some video content. Much the same as any, I guess, corporation or institution would do. But I do think it's important to acknowledge, as I did earlier, the ongoing importance of traditional media. I have 10,000 Twitter followers, but if I have an article that's picked up in the national newspapers, that can be 5 million people that are reading it.
Yeah.
So the reach is just completely different scale. So we do also do quite a bit of work with media, and particularly around the values piece. So if we are doing a lot of stuff for International Women's Day, I find that gets quite good take up, or that we do in support of LGBTIQ communities, for example, or new trade and investment announcements as well. So, yeah, we work pretty hard across the media spectrum. It's such a great way to tell our story. And I think in both you have to be authentic, right? If you're putting out Twitter content, it has to be your own voice. People pretty quickly are not very engaged by stuff that's a bit cookie cutter. So I think you mentioned we might talk about this a bit later, but the Women's Soccer World Cup is going on in Australia. Yeah. And so there's a lot of content going out from all of my colleagues around the world in support of that. And it feels really authentic because we Australians love our sport. We're known to love our sport. People are not surprised that we're super engaged by hosting Women's Soccer World Cup.
Yeah, it's Australia is just synonymous with sports to, Indians here. So,
but then it's also a great platform to get out messaging around the importance of sport for women in leadership, the importance of equal pay for women in sport, like normalizing sport is something that women should do. So, there's that double benefit again there that we're often looking for in our social media.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, no, I just wanted to end by, just asking your thoughts on, the Women's FIFA World Cup that's currently going on. I know it's a big day for Australia as you take on Canada. It's a big match. But yeah, by the time the episode is up, I guess the fate of the team would be sort of sealed. But what are your thoughts on, the FIFA World Cup and how it, goes to promote grassroots level sport, but also for women here, both in India and in Australia?
Yeah, you're right. We'll know the result well before you're published. So I'm not going to be rash and make any predictions, but of course we'll be cheering the Matildas on, and whether they're victorious in the game tonight or not, they'll still have the support of the Australian people. Yeah. Women in sport is something that we really like to focus on because it's such a great pathway for women to experience leadership opportunities, teamwork opportunities. In Australia, it's very normal for girls to play sport, but that's not the case all around the world. So actually for something like the Women's World Cup, we've been thinking about it, for over a year now, because in early 2022, actually India hosted the Asian Football Women's World Cup, which was one of the qualifying rounds for the World Cup. And so we did a bit of programming at that time. We've supported girls soccer teams through the DAP program we were talking about recently. We've also done some training for women in news and sport who are journalists who kind of want to be able to broadcast about women playing sport, and it's quite traditionally a male field. So there's a lot of things you can build around it and use as a platform. So it's been a wonderful thing for Australia to host the Women's Soccer World Cup. We hope the Matildas do well, but even if our journey isn't going any further, I know there'll still be big crowds turning out to watch the game.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it's such a pleasure watching any sport that takes place in Australia, because I think the vibe and, the buzz around any sporting event is just spectacular. So yeah, thanks, Sarah. This was wonderful chatting with you. And thanks for taking us through some of the initiatives that the Consul General, does in India. So yeah, we'll sort of plug in some of the work of the Consul General in our episode show notes so that our listeners can have a look at it. So thanks for joining, Sarah, and hope to be in touch again soon.
Thanks, Carl, very much for having me. A pleasure talking to you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.